Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am writing campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. In our first episode of season 2, I talked to Andrew about his abuse and about the self-doubt and self-blame that comes with it. This is his story. Okay, Andrew, welcome to FTD Talk.
Thank you.
And I'd like to start off by asking you how you and your abuser met.
Okay, yeah. Do you know, I just moved to London. I graduated from uni, and I was quite lonely. And I met her at this kind of church party thing, and she was just a very lively personality, and we got on. We started dating, and you know, really early on, there were obviously issues, and this is one of my points about domestic abuse is that I think a lot of people make they make the error of thinking that for a sensible person to fall into abuse, presumably they were conned, and then it was too late. And certainly, a good friend of mine is a female, and she met her husband, and he was just amazing, brilliant guy. And then after the wedding, he was just a nightmare, and was very abusive. And they're now divorced. And she was conned, she was tricked, hoodwinked, or whatever word you come up with. But not everybody falls into abuse like that. And for me, my now ex-wife was as she was at the end. She was throughout entirely abusive, suicide attempts, erratic behavior, bizarre outbursts. But I guess, I was the kind of guy when I met her where I wasn't high on my own confidence anyway. I didn't have a lot of self-belief. I really liked helping people. I was a very caring, sensitive guy, and I didn't have really clear boundaries. If you'd have asked me back then in my early 20s about my boundaries, I'd have been like, what are you talking about? I don't know. Is that a limit to how much you drink? I don't know. And so I think it's very easy for people who are a little bit naive but want to help to fall into those kind of abusive relationships. And so very quickly I found myself in this just crazy, all-consuming relationship that was just bizarre roller coaster ride. And once you're on it, it's very hard to get off it. That's the reality.
Did you fall for it very quickly? Because I hear that a lot, that people in my own case as well, that people fall for their abuser very quickly. Was that the same for yourself?
Yeah, I think that is true. I think looking back now, I was quite at that time. I was quite needy. I was pretty lonely. Um, Actually, she was the one that was pushing to get married very quickly. I think I've always been quite a cautious person. I felt like we were moving too fast, but I just didn't know how to say no to her because she was a formidable character. And before I knew it, there was a ring on her finger and it was moving fast. But I just would have been too afraid to put the brakes on. I was very afraid of her and very wary of her from very early on, which sounds crazy now. You'd be like, well, surely just like walk away. But it's very hard once you're in it, and your whole life becomes about offsetting the likelihood of an explosion happening. And I started going into work. I had injuries on my face, cuts, scratches, bruises, and people would say, "Hey, what's up with your face?" And I'd be like, "Always, it was always a shaving accident." And I sometimes wondered whether they'd ever think, "Do you know what? This guy has a lot of shaving accidents. Something's going on," but they never did. And I quickly was just all consumed by this relationship. She would often try and start rows deliberately at like midnight when I was going to bed. There'd be, we've had a nice evening, and then suddenly I'm trying to like diffuse the outburst, but it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. And so at work, my work performance was really suffering. And yeah, it just, once you're in it, it's just so hard to get out of it.
Was it very aggressive very quickly then?
It was very crazy very quickly. There were, she confided in me a lot early on in the early months. about this terrible abusive childhood. Brother had abused her sexually, but don't tell anyone. And she's since repaired her relationship with him, and you know, and I kind of, I found that really hard trying to get on with her brother when I had this information about him, which today I don't actually believe that ever happened at all. She was very good at dividing and conquering. There were suicide attempts in about the second month we were together, but the violence was pretty quick. It was within 3 or 4 months, the first true episode where she went for my face and physically attacked me. And I would say, looking back, it wasn't like she was violent every day or even every week. There was usually an explosion every week, but the violence probably happened one in every 3 or 4 times, where she would throw keys at me, or she would punch me, kick me, bite me. But I think sometimes we, as men, we can minimize a woman punching you. Oh, well, it's just a slap. A real man can put up with that. But actually, my wife floored me on a couple of occasions. She had a hell of a punch, and I was very afraid of her as I would be if it was a guy beating me up. And there was always this sense of it just being totally out of control. I wouldn't know what she'd grab. I wouldn't know where this was going. I wouldn't know how to diffuse it. Obviously then, as it's all kicking off, as the victim, you're in panic mode. You're not thinking clearly, you're not thinking rationally. You just want it to stop. And so people will say, well, early on you didn't have kids, so why didn't you leave? I can understand when you've got kids you wouldn't leave, because of course there might be issues with access with your kids. If the woman keeps the kids, as is generally the case, then you're going to definitely see them a lot less, if you even see them at all. But before kids, well, why didn't you leave? And I do think that abusers are very good. We have this term gaslighting, where they're very good at weaving stories, at manipulating you, so you doubt your own sanity, you doubt your own instincts. And I definitely lost sight of my own instincts very quickly. And so if ever there was an outburst, it was always my fault. I provoked it. I genuinely believed that. And it was all, rather than her behaving out of order, her being out of order, I was out of order for having got her into that state. And I was going to counseling, reading self-help books. I never did find that the magic key for how to be that better man that didn't send his wife into meltdown. But that's what I believe. So why would I walk away when I'm desperately trying hard to be the better person, and when I feel like the outbursts are all my fault?
And did you feel that immediately? Did you feel did she blame you for that, or were you just made to feel like that?
I was definitely, the way that, after an explosion, after the first few explosions of suicide attempts, there was always a sense that it was my fault. So yeah, I mean, blame was put on me early on for not having enough friends, for having, at the time that I met her, I was extremely muscular, because I'd done a lot of weightlifting at university, but I was quite skinny. And it's a great thing being skinny as a bloke. If you do a lot of weights, the definition shows very quickly. And so I was pretty ripped when I met her, and my body made her sick, my muscles made her sick, and so everything from like the little things, the blame was on me. If everything was ever forgotten, little things, it would be my fault. You didn't do this. And it might not necessarily be that she's shouting and screaming the blame at me. It might just be that she's calmly blaming me. But also with the rows, it was always my fault. If I hadn't have done this, I never had my own ideas. The pressure was always on her to take the initiative. So then I was like, shit, I better start taking the initiative. But then when I tried to take the initiative, I'd always make the wrong decision, and it's scary. If you're with someone who's explosive, any idea that you come up with that could not work very well, that's a massive risk. And so, I did take a step back. I did want her to make the decisions, and then I try and work around them and make sure that nothing went wrong to the best of my ability. So that dynamic definitely developed quickly and from early on. I think I felt that when I married her, by being kind to her over time, she would change, and the relationship would get easier. It was a massive wedding, and there was no sense of me of bailing out of that. And I'm the kind of guy that I see things through. And I think the other thing that I do in my performance coaching is tenacious people. Listen, tenacity is important, but tenacious people often hang in there too long. They keep up with this never ever give up. And sometimes we need to give up. Sometimes we need to change direction and alter course. Some people have the mantra of never give up, but there's another mantra of wake up and smell the coffee. And so, but I think that my tenacity in this situation was actually a real weakness, that kept me believing that I would change if I just kept trying. Good people try hard at their marriages; they don't walk away.
With the suicide attempts that she made, did that hook you in further? Did that make you feel more protective?
Definitely.
Do you think they were real? They were real attempts?
No. Yeah, I believed at the time. At the time, I did. It was probably about the third time where I thought, I'm not sure that she actually would. But the very first time, I remember we'd been out on a date. We were a little bit drunk, but not particularly, not hammered. We'd had a bottle of wine and a bit and a meal. We'd been into the pub, but I hadn't remembered what we were drinking. But we were coming home on the train. We were living in Balham at the time. We're at the train station, and suddenly she just ran away from me over the station platform. And I thought it was a joke at first, so I kind of run after her. But she's like looks really scared, and like I'm thinking, I was like, what's going on? What I don't know. What is it? Are you okay? And then she's running on the train away from me, and then I'm thinking, well, people are going to think that I'm chasing her, and I'm they're going to be asking, so I didn't really know the best way of handling it. So I get on the train, and I just sort of, the train then pulls away, and I'm walking down the carriage. She's desperately trying to move into the next carriage. So I'm like, so now we're sitting in separate carriages, and I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? And so when we got off at Balham, she's then running down the high street. And then I thought, well, do you know what? I'll go back to my flat. And I go back to the flat, and I get this phone call on the flat, I'm going to kill myself. I'm doing it. And I'm sort of begging her not to kill herself. And then I just hear these cars screeching to a halt. So I honestly thought she had stepped out in front of a car. Whether she had or she hadn't, I don't know. But I definitely, that was the first time she had a suicide attempt. It was very early on in our relationship. And I definitely thought it was real and happening. But then once someone has a different way that they're going to kill themselves, and then the third, and then the fourth time, and I didn't, as they passed, it was just another thing to manage. I don't think I ever particularly thought she was going to do it after that.
Right. So when she is blaming you, and you feel responsible for the suicide attempts, you feel responsible for the explosions, how are you feeling at this point? I know that you're blaming yourself, but are you in deep depression? Are you confused? What's happening in your head?
Really confused, really beating myself up. I definitely was depressed. People that knew me at the time, although I didn't have clear boundaries and I was a nice, sensitive boy growing up and as a teenager, I was always quite outgoing, and had a lot of I am an extrovert by nature as well. But that definitely went. My sense of humor went. People noticed that I was always really, I've always been slender, but like I was really skinny and always jumpy and edgy. And I felt, for sort of the 10 years that I was with my now ex-wife, I think that's probably the best way of describing me, just constantly on edge. Even if we're on holiday somewhere and it's going quite well, or the back of your mind, you're always wondering when it's all going to go horribly wrong. And you're always trying to think about, well, what things could make this go wrong, and what do I need to do to stop that happening? And so what then happens is you become very manipulative yourself, because you in the background you're manipulating, trying to stop things from going wrong. So like a stupid example, I remember when we were married, I broke her favorite wine glass, and she was out at the time, and I remember thinking, oh no, she's going to go mad. And we were having a difficult time anyway at that point. So I swept up the glass and I actually put it in the neighbour's bin. I sort of took it out of the house and put it in the neighbour's bin. And of course, breathed a sigh of relief when the rubbish van came the next day. But it was a couple of days later till she noticed, and she was like, "Have you seen my wine glass? I haven't seen that anywhere." I was like, "No, I don't know where it is." And I pulled it off, and I remember thinking, "Phew." And I just wouldn't do that today. Like it just, if I
Wow.
broke my wife today, she's a wonderful woman. If I broke a wine glass, I'd go and tell her, if it's her favorite wine glass, I'd be like, I am so sorry I've broken your wine glass. I probably wouldn't even say I'm so sorry. I mean, I guess if it had sentimental value and I felt really bad about it, but she'd be like, if it had sentimental value, she might be temporarily sad about it, but like it wouldn't enter my head to go to kind of hide it, not tell her. But that's what you do in abusive situations. You compromise your integrity, you lie, cheat, steal if you have to. You do whatever you have to get through day by day.
And are you talking to anybody at this point? Have you told any friends, any family?
No, no. I mean, I had some counselling sessions, but they were with my ex-wife, so it was always on the basis that I was a crap husband and how could I be a better man. Um,
Yeah.
so, um, and looking back, I do think, to be fair to those counsellors, they tried to ask gentle questions that might get me to wake up a little bit without completely sending my wife into a tailspin. But I just wasn't in that place to where I would open up. Definitely, and I've said this, in a number of sort of talks I've done, had my employer at the time being really up to date in their awareness, I did have a relationship with my line manager. He was a really good guy where I think if he'd have challenged me, I probably would have opened up. He's a great guy, but at that time, back in sort of 2000, 2001, 2002, there just wasn't that same level of awareness I think that there is today and around men's mental health. The fact that suddenly wasn't, I wasn't performing. I felt I was caught falling asleep on the phone to one of my clients. There was a few things that you might think, hey, is he all right? Something's not quite right here. But they just got angrier and angrier that my performance got worse and worse, and that I was taking more and more sick leave. I wasn't actually sick at all, but I was trying to sort of look after by that time, our first daughter had been born, and my wife, as you can imagine, wasn't coping. So I was taking more and more time off just to try and manage the time at home. And I used up all my annual leave. And so now I was having to dig into the sick leave. But at no point did my employer sit down and say, look, this doesn't feel right. We know you're a good guy, but come on, talk to us. Had a conversation like that happened, I think I probably would have opened up.
And I suppose that's putting even more pressure on you, isn't it? Because you're getting pressure from work, you're getting pressure from home. So you're suffering on two fronts there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was horrendous. I used to, there's a bit of a walk from the train station to my work. And I used to spend most of the walk to there and the walk back because, I was a Christian. And I'd be sort of, berating God for the situation that I was in, and why am I this like this, and why is everything so stressful, and why haven't I got more money? If I had more money, then our problems would be solved. And I was in lost. I lived my life at such a high level of stress, and then it came to a head because this is really bizarre, but I ended up setting up on my own because I was in recruitment at the time as an independent headhunter, and I did very well at it. I made a lot of money, but the reason why I set that business up was simply because I realized that it isn't possible to be in an abusive relationship and be beholden to someone else, your employer, in the contracted way. It's just not possible. You can't manage those two things, or I couldn't. And so I thought, at least if I set up my own business on my own, I'll be the boss of my own hours. Obviously, there's a financial risk, but there is in recruitment anyway. So my reason for setting up my own business was not because I had ambitions to be an entrepreneur. I was a fairly rubbish entrepreneur. I think there was a lot of good fortune at that time. We were in the boom years. But the reason I set up my own business was because I figured I'd be better able to manage my wife, who was, and working from home and all that kind of stuff. And, it did kind of work. I mean, I didn't spend lots of time on the business, as a lot of entrepreneurs would in the early years. I was only working a 3-day week, but I made enough money for us to survive, and more. We had a good lifestyle, and it definitely temporarily helped, just because it meant she could lie in the mornings and do a lot less, basically. Not that she wasn't actually working at the time anyway, but yeah. So that it's funny how this abusive relationship actually gave birth to me going out on my own and setting up my own business. That was the motivation. Um, but it was when I think of those years when I was contracted to somebody else and dealing with abuse at home, it was horrendous. And my hope for employers increasingly is that awareness grows, that policies are put in place that are not just created by some HR bloke or woman as a tick box exercise, but that the HR team works closely with staff, that really has those conversations about domestic abuse. What do we do as a team here if we've got someone that we think could be experiencing domestic abuse? What do we do as a team here if it comes to light that someone's facing allegations of domestic abuse, which may or may not be false? What do we do if we've got a relationship within work and there is allegations of domestic abuse and both people are employed by us? These conversations need to be had, given how common domestic abuse is. And my hope is that by having those conversations and creating policies where, like I said, it's not just the HR going off on a limb and doing a tick box exercise. My hope is that awareness will grow and that employers, and particularly after the COVID thing, become much more caring and interested in their employees' lives, because we all know that whatever happens outside of work will spill into work. There's no way you can keep that separate.
No, I mean, employers will tell you to leave your troubles at the door, but that's really difficult, if not impossible sometimes.
Yeah.
And how did your feelings towards your wife change, if they did? Because if you're blaming yourself, then obviously she hasn't got anything to be sorry for. But did your feelings change because of
Yeah.
the violence?
So what happened was, and I refer to this in my TEDx talk. It's how I open my talk up. Not that this is a shameless plug for my TEDx talk, but yeah, I thought I'd get it in there quick. But in 2006, so we've been together, 7 years. We were living in the south of France, and I was operating my recruitment business from the south of France, from my garden shed, and it worked surprisingly well. And we were living there. It was quite a nice life, but our neighbor, we were living like in a medieval town, and most people just left their front doors unlocked in the day, at least, and we did too. And our neighbor was an English woman, and she was a big drinker, and she and my wife were sort of drinking buddies. And she actually heard an absolute meltdown, as she heard quite a few meltdowns, to be fair, but this one was particularly bad. And she came into the house as my ex-wife was stabbing me in the arm with this sharpened pencil. My arm was really quite blooded. And I remember her persuading my wife to go down next door with her and calm down. And I remember coming back to me that evening, this neighbor who I got on very well with. She's a nice woman. And she said, she's got very well-to-do voice. She's like, Andrew, this is domestic abuse. She really was, and I remember it was the first time anyone had ever really said something like that to me so directly. And like, it's not that changed me instantly, but it started a train of thought. It started a change where it was like, actually, maybe this isn't right. Maybe it's not all my fault. And once you start to go down that road and you start to think like that, you start to realize in an abusive relationship, actually, there's an awful lot of stuff that probably isn't my fault. Now, that didn't necessarily start the end. It started a train of thought where I think I was beginning to think, actually, what are my options here? This is really bad. Do I get out? Do I stay? What about the kids? Because we, by this point, got 2 daughters. How would that work? And then my now ex-wife took the decision out of my hands by kicking me out anyway. And what I didn't know at the time was she was having an affair with someone who I think she thought she was going to get together with. So I, like a bit of a wally, kept trying to make the marriage work. We went to marriage guidance, and all the while not knowing that she was having this affair. But as I was living down the road from still doing loads of stuff with the kids, but hey, at least I was seeing them and all that kind of stuff. I started to experience what life would be like if I didn't live with my wife. And I realized life's amazing not living with my, this is wonderful. Like, and actually, I get on, like, the dynamic with the kids is so much better when she's not there, because we're not on edge. We're just ourselves, this happy threesome. We're a nice little unit. And I might not, she had everybody taking her meals, neighbors looking, and friends all rallying around her because, she's awful situation she's in. And she had this useless husband that she'd had to kick out. And there's loads of drama going on that at the time I just was blissfully unaware of, because I was down the road in my nice little bungalow in the countryside in the south of France with a glorious view, repairing. And so when she decided, when it was clear this relationship she was having wasn't going to work out, and she came back to me and was like, well, maybe I will have you back. Maybe. I was like, well, I don't know that I want to come back. And that started a whole just extraordinary drama, which, I mean, listen, if you wanted to break the record for the longest podcast ever, I'll go into detail and we'll be here all day. But basically the upshot, I didn't go back in the end. And really that break from living with her for 3 or 4 months, that wasn't even my choice. That was the thing where I was like, actually, no, I can't go back. I'm not going back. And it's better that my daughters see less of me, but when they do see me, I'm a repaired individual, then I live with them again as a shadow of my former self. And I actually thought, I'm going to be in an early grave if I go back. I will. The stress will kill me, and I can't go back to that. And so then I moved back to England, but I was going back to France every month to see my girls. And I made the wise decision to sort of try and steer, if I had a girlfriend, keep them well away from my daughters, because I just didn't want to antagonize my ex-wife. And, my contact was so important. But in the end, I figured my ex-wife would move back to England too, which she did months later. She lived in Dorset, I lived in Birmingham. When we got into this pattern where I did have my daughters every fortnight, it was always on my ex-wife's terms. I never had them for Christmas, which was hard. Never had them on their birthdays. But I just figured, you know what? As long as I have fortnightly contact with them, I'm not going to argue too much. I'm just going to put up with it. And then the trouble, the trouble really started when I met my now wife, who's wonderful. And she started to get to know our daughters. And that was when my ex-wife blocked our contact completely. And I took her to court and ended up securing custody, which is not what I expected when I took her to court. So, yeah, I mean, but it's interesting that I think without that neighbour's wake-up call and without my ex-wife kicking me out, I might still be with her today. I might be in an early grave. I might be in a grave, and I'm very grateful that I know the guy who she had the affair with. And, if I saw him today, I'd shake his hand, I think.
And do you think with that wake-up call, did you start to notice more things about the way your wife was treating you?
Yeah.
Did you become more aware?
Yes, absolutely. I became aware, at least, that actually in life I faced lose-lose situations, that my ex-wife would put me in situations very deliberately where whatever option I then chose, it was going to result in an explosion, because that is what she wanted. And once you start to see that more and more, that fear, it doesn't go away, but what comes alongside that fear is a whole lot of contempt. And once you start to feel contemptuous towards your other half, there's no way back from that. It's very hard to suddenly put that contempt to one side. And the other thing, once I started to feel contemptuous towards her, was I started to realize that there was just so much. She was such a liar. Everything was a lie. And again, once that trust is gone, once you know that you cannot trust, if she says she's gone to Tesco's, she's probably gone to Sainsbury's. Once it gets to that level, there's nowhere to go. The only way is for that relationship to be over. Yeah. So once I had that wake up call, it definitely marked a sea change. And my hope for people, and my hope with growing awareness is that more of us are looking out for each other, men and women. We're looking out for each other, and we're able to, in love and with respect, challenge each other and be each other's wake up call. Because the one thing an abuser does not want, they do not want wake up calls around the person they're abusing, which is why they'll often manipulate their victims' relationships with close friends and family, and they'll try and alienate them and isolate their victim from close friends and family, wearing those relationships down. Because the last thing that abuser wants, it is very nervy, it's very, very edgy for an abuser if their victim has really close friends where there's confidence, where they would confide in each other, where there's a brother or a mum or whatever it may be. And so that's my hope with awareness, that we can all, if you have a victim that's been alienated from their sisters or mum and dad, that they've got colleagues at least that can spot the signs and gently challenge. And I do think awareness is growing, not just in terms of women suffering, but men too. We're seeing gender neutral campaigns from some police forces, West Mids, Cumbria, which is really exciting to see. And I know there's a long way to go. And I know at the higher political levels, it's still a gendered narrative. But I do think things are changing. And I'm encouraged from what I've seen since my TEDx talk went live. A lot of women coming back to me saying, listen, it happened to my brother, it happened to my husband. He was in a really bad way at the time, but didn't report it. But the fact that women are coming back to me, and it is mostly women saying that, well, the men are obviously speaking about this in their homes, at least at the moment. And, hopefully the next stage is that men will talk even more publicly about it, and with other men and in men's groups. And so I do think we're on a road to change, which is good.
I mean, that's why I created this FTD Talk, because it does need to be said. People do need to speak out, but they need a supportive and non-judgmental platform in which to do
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And obviously, that we need to. I mean, I actually love it when I'm challenged. I love it when men and women say to me, "Why did you stay?" What? Surely a real man would you just hit her back. I mean, I've heard that said. I was on a radio show with just name dropping here, but BBC West Mids. It's actually a couple of years ago, and a caller rang in and said, "Surely you'd have to be a bit of a wimp to be a male victim of domestic abuse." But I love hearing statements like that, because it gives me the chance to respond with dignity and respect towards a person that has that view. And so we do need to create this kind of platform where men are taken seriously, where they're believed. But personally, like I say, if someone's going to challenge me, then bring it on, and let's have a rational conversation about it. A good friend of mine, actually, he contacted me after my TED talk, because he'd just seen me promoting it. And I'd known him really well in a business setting a few years ago. And he's 6'5". He is built like a tank. He is a formidable character. He's a lawyer. He's got his own practice. And he was virtually on the brink of suicide due to the sheer level of emotional abuse he suffered at the hands of his female partner. And I think that's the point. It can happen to anybody: big men, little men, skinny men, overweight men. All men of all shapes and sizes. It can happen to. And I think this sense that actually, men will be less affected it is a nonsense, and we need to dispel that myth. So the more people that say that, the more opportunity it gives us to respond to that. And I think, obviously in terms of suicide, from what I see on social media and research, that the link between domestic abuse, parental alienation, and suicide, there is a link. You talk to suicide charities. I had a conversation with a guy from a suicide charity, and he was saying, from what he sees, finances and parental alienation, those tend to be the two biggest triggers. And I would imagine that sort of ex-military is probably another trigger. But more needs to be done on that to really understand that link. But as men and women, we need to take each other seriously when abuse is being reported. And of course, the other really important face of domestic abuse, which is often ignored, is parents abused by their kids. And again, we when educating on domestic abuse, men are victims, women are victims, parents are victims by their own children. This is a growing problem. I've seen police reports. There's an article, I can't remember the newspaper that it was in, but it was from the Northumberland police, where they were saying they're really seeing a rise in abuse of parents by teenagers. And all of this we need to bring out into the open, so that people get used to hearing about it, so that then people aren't massively shocked when they hear it, but they can be calm and rational and supportive.
And is this what you do with your TED Talks? Do you do excuse me? Do you do presentations in as well as TED Talks?
I do. It's interesting. So I do a lot of public speaking for my own sort of performance coaching business around productivity, procrastination, getting more done, but without getting busier and burnt out, boundaries and stuff like that. How to be tougher, but without becoming a jerk at the same time. And I thought off the back of the TED Talk that there'd be a lot of sort of talks around domestic abuse. But the one area where I'm speaking, I've got a number of events coming up in the autumn, is actually the stuff that happened after the abusive relationship seems to be of a lot of interest at the moment. So the stuff around the family courts and parental alienation, some of the prejudice, I haven't gone into it in detail on this podcast, but around gender biases, around how my ex-wife was able to hoodwink social services because she's very articulate and middle class, and knows that if you're going to get a visit from the social services, you have freshly baked biscuits that morning, you have the smell of coffee in the house is spotless, and then you speak well and you're all laughing and joking with them, and that, so I've got a few events coming up where my experiences after the relationship broke down is what they want me to focus on, particularly around sort of safeguarding and children. And actually there are instances where a woman will allege abuse, but actually she herself is the abuser. So how do schools even deal with that? And a lot of the talks that I'm doing will be around like our natural human biases and how we handle those and deal with those. So yeah, I've got increasing talks coming up, but like I say, not necessarily totally focused on domestic abuse, more focused on the gender bias aspect, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I found in my own abuse, the aftermath was just as bad as the abuse.
Yeah.
The psychological state I was left in was just as bad as what I went through.
Yeah.
So I do think that the aftermath, and especially if you've got, if you're fighting through family court and fighting for your kids, I think that's just going to affect your psychological and emotional state anyway.
Yeah, no, I because I think as well, like everybody's battle is different. I mentioned my 6'5" friend. Now he didn't have kids with his ex-abuser, but the whole breakdown of that relationship really affected him badly. I think for me, having kids meant that I couldn't just walk away from my ex-wife. And I think had I been able to just literally walk away, I think I'd have repaired much more quickly. But having kids, you've got to continue to be in relationship. You're continuing to get hurt. You're continuing to have to juggle and dance around your ex-wife when you're trying to move on. It's really hard. It's really hard. And then if you do get unlucky at court and the court's back the abusive partner, which they often do because they don't have a lot of time on each individual case, and some of the people in the courts can be very prejudiced themselves. If you get that situation where your abuser sort of scores another major victory over you and it's to do with your contact with the kids, that's just, that's horrendous. That's just awful.
There is a massive bias out there when you've got people like Women's Aid. When you open their website, it says that domestic abuse is a gendered crime, and they're a very powerful organisation. When you've got the police, who I've heard stories time and time again of male victims phoning the police talking about their abuse, the police turn up and arrest the guy. So the prejudice is out there, and we do need somehow to kill that prejudice off.
I think that's true. I think for me, I've been really heartened in the response from people on the ground, because as you can imagine, in promoting my TEDx talk, I'm trying to link up with people in safeguarding, social services, the police, and there's been a tremendous support for the message. And I do believe that on the ground, things are slowly changing. But you're right. You mentioned Women's Aid. They're a very powerful lobbying group who want a lot of influence over the new domestic abuse bill that's going to obviously come out eventually. And they're pushing that narrative very, very hard. But it's amazing. Listen, my TEDx talk is called Domestic Abuse, Not a Gender Issue. And I get very little resistance to it, and I'm linking up with people in Women's Aid, the White Ribbon chat, so some of these very, very pro women's organizations, and I'm getting very, very little resistance. Very few. I could probably count on one hand the amount of people that have come back to me quite stridently saying, it is a gendered issue and whatever. People have been very supportive. People coming back saying, no, you're right, I absolutely agree, I can see it's complicated, there's parents abused by there's many faces to domestic abuse, and so you're right, it's very prejudiced. There are men still getting a terrible deal in court, but the thing with parental alienation, for me, because we were taken back to court several years later when my ex-wife tried to get the decision reversed, and she wasn't successful in doing so. But I was in court accused of parental alienation. And I think, having been on both sides of the fence now, of being a dad that was alienated, but then I won custody, but then being back in court accused of being the alienator, because my daughters eventually ceased contact with their mum because they're finding going down too stressful. And I was really hauled over the coals for not forcing contact, even though my daughters were 12 and 15. My point was, well, if I was to force my daughters, it would, I'd have to lift them kicking, screaming into the car. That's physical assault. So I'm not really going to do that. But I do think that parental alienation is a complicated subject. There are women at court whose husbands are abusive, and they're trying to defend their kids, and having children forced into contact with abusive men in the name of preventing parental alienation. That is wrong. Also, where you've then got manipulative women squeezing dads out of their kids' lives, or even the other way around, that is also wrong. And we have to try and find a way of preventing parental alienation from happening, but also preventing children from being forced into contact with abusive people. That is a difficult dilemma of how you do that in court when cases are complicated. And like I said, the judges don't get a lot of individual time on each case. And there's so much mudslinging at court, so many false allegations, men and women were as bad as each other in the courts. And so how to unpick that is a big question, a big question.
Well, I think we've got a long way to go, but with people like yourself out there speaking the truth, hopefully we can get there a little bit quicker.
I hope so. And I think, my passion is for rational conversations, and that men and women, we call out the haters and dividers, and there are haters and dividers that are men, and there are haters and dividers that are women. And I think if men and women can be calling out the men and women that divide and hate, that's a really good thing. And I'm really heartened. A little thing I was going to say, there was a woman, most of the stuff she posts on LinkedIn is really balanced. She works in housing, but has a lot to do with domestic abuse. And she posted this post that was a huge agendered post about, instead of asking why doesn't she leave, we should be asking why doesn't she stay. And I just put a comment on it saying, shouldn't we just be asking why don't they leave, why don't they stay? Domestic abuse affects men, women, parents abused by their teenagers, whatever. It's quite a short, very polite comment. The amount of likes I've had on that comment, I think I'm at about 45 likes. And if you go and check it out, you've probably got better things to do, but there's a lot of women, there's a hell of a lot of women that have liked that, and that have added then to my comment saying it absolutely is not a gendered issue. And so I think we just need to keep talking. If the domestic abuse that comes out, if it is gendered, we must not give up. We must keep talking, because I do think at a ground level, awareness is growing, but it's one of those things that will take time for it to filter up into the areas where policies are made.
And on that very positive note, I'd like to thank you for talking with me on FTD Talk today.
Now, it's been a privilege. Absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Cool.
Take care, Andrew.
All the best to you. Thanks.
Thank you.
John.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Hello, and thank you for listening. This is the second season of FTD Talk. The first season was 8 episodes long, and I have 6 episodes already recorded for the second season. Many male victims of abuse are coming out to talk. Together, we can beat this. Until next week, you take care. Peace.
Nothing I could do is ever good enough for you.